Pacific Gas and Electric, a utility in California that is now facing bankruptcy because it is being sued by virtually everybody in California because of its, I'm trying to be nice, its insufficient care in relationship to the fires that burnt half the state down. And so it's not going to survive as a corporate entity unless it goes through a very extreme bankruptcy, which will wipe out many of its creditors, shareholders, and so on. But what I find so remarkable, and the only reason I'm bringing it up, is that the whole premise of the suits is that they were incompetent in doing what they should have done and preparing and taking into account the risks of fire and all of the rest of it. And yet there's no question, no concept that maybe you shouldn't reconstitute another utility, whatever it's called, in its place, after you've cleaned up the enormous mess of the corporation that can't go on because it's bankrupt. You might imagine, for example, that you would rethink how a utility ought to work. Maybe it shouldn't be a private corporation honing in on profits, cutting corners where maybe you shouldn't have, doing a little extra in a state that was experiencing droughts for several years, in a state where the fire risks were known to be going on. Maybe a utility should be careful. And so maybe you shouldn't set it up as a private profit-making corporation. Maybe you should set it up as a public cooperative in which the decisions are made in part by the workers who know the details of how to run it, and in part by the customers who are worried about what kind of service or what kind of fire they're going to get, depending on the decisions that are made. I understand that there is no serious conversation in California about that. I may have missed it, but I didn't notice any. I read all about the bankruptcy and the details of what creditors will get paid off and what creditors will get nothing and what creditors will get a little bit, and all the usual kinds of stuff about bankruptcy, but questioning the concept of having our utilities run as private profit-making enterprise doesn't enter. And it's a little bit like the banking system. The banks all went belly up, the big ones, in 2008 and 9. They collapsed. I assume you all know that. In 2009, every one of the major American banks, Wells Fargo, Citibank, JP Morgan Chase, Bank America, were all bankrupt. They could not meet their liability, their obligations. They were saved by the Federal Reserve System and by the United States government. The Federal Reserve gave them basically limitless loans, and the United States government invented, it's very important, invented non-voting shares. It's really interesting. They got the banks to issue special shares, which you buy like any share of any company, right? Doesn't pay dividends, and you can't vote. You don't get a vote for the share the way you would if you bought a common stock. So it's basically a way of giving the company a lot of money and not encumbering the company with your vote or any obligation to give you any money back. Wow. How nice. What a wonderful thing. So the banks whose speculations in mortgage securities, MBS as they were called, mortgage-backed securities, and credit default swaps, some of you remember those things. The banks speculated in them, that went belly up, the system crashed, they went to Washington, they wanted a bailout, they got a bailout, government money, Federal Reserve cash, bailed them out, saved the situation for them. And nowhere along the way was the idea, let's see, if they brought the crisis, and if we're bailing them out, we ought to have some claim, some quid pro quo. We're not going to punish you for bringing on the crisis. We're not going to withhold saving you, but you've got to, if your stock comes back up, some of that has to come back to the people who helped you and the people whom you harmed for the 10 years since that crash, a lot of people have not come back to where they were before. Nothing. No conditions, no payback, nothing. General Motors, which got the single biggest bailout, $50 billion, has, to this point, paid back 40. So we're all out $10 billion. And paying back, no interest. So they had several years. It's extraordinary. And for that, the United States government, nothing gets in it. Has no share of General Motors, has no share in its profit, nothing. And then the banks, because it's really a variation of the Amazon story, if you think about it. And this week, we had another chapter. The Trump administration arranged for a woman named Liang, I don't know if you picked it up, to apply for a position on the Federal Reserve Board, which she did. They have not had very many women on the Federal Reserve Board. I'm being polite. And so this was a chance. This is a woman who has a long history of working in financial regulation. But obviously she's not a big regulator, otherwise Trump would never have put her up for this. She withdrew her nomination this last week, so she's out of the running. Why? The banks don't want her. She was a little bit more interested in regulation than they want. So let's be clear. The banks are using the money we, the people, gave them in their time of need to lobby the Congress to prevent a person who might regulate them. We're paying to remove an active regulator from our agency that supervises the banks, and we gave them the money with which to prevent. I hope this takes your breath away. You live in this. And I'm just giving you the tip of the proverbial iceberg here in terms of what's going on. All right, let's turn to the issues today. Because I don't want bad news to prevail, let me tell you about what I believe is extraordinarily good news. And before I do, let me tell you where you might want to go to learn about this. I'm talking about the yellow vest, gilet jaune movement in France, which is now about 7 weeks, more or less, old. So it's very young, it's very new. It is absolutely extraordinary what is going on there. It almost makes you think again that France is the place where that revolution happened back in 1789, and that they have some sort of taste over there for it. It's not just their cuisine that's remarkable, but it's their something else is remarkable. Where would you go to get the best? There's a lot of literature now coming out. Much of it is lopsided, but one of the best places is the major French newspaper called Le Monde, the world in French, Le Monde. And the editor there, the chief editor, is a man named Serge, I think Halimi or Halimi, I'm not sure which of the two. But you can look him up, Le Monde or Serge Halimi. He has a couple of recent articles that are mainly lead editorials analyzing the yellow vest movement. It is very balanced, very careful to look at strengths and weaknesses, not all gooey with romantic stuff. I'm about to do that. But I'm more balanced. It's really excellent, and if you're interested, that would be the place I would go. Okay, just to make sure we're all on the same page. 7 weeks ago, Mr. I'm tempted to say Magoo, but it's Macron. You'll see, he really is Mr. Magoo. But Mr. Macron, in a fit of excitement about doing something ecological to improve the environment, came to that wonderful conclusion that people like him often do, when it was a question of doing something for the environment, which he hadn't done much about before, that this should be paid for by the French people. And so he slapped a tax on the cost of gas and oil and fuels and so forth to raise the money to do this good thing for the environment. Okay? And a funny thing happened. The French people, I'm talking about virtually all of them, 60, 70%. We know that's the number because there have been consistent Ipsos and other pollings of the French people, and 60 to 80%, depending on the day, are in support of this movement. It is a majority endorsed movement. Very important for you to understand that. It is that way today, and it was that way last week, and it was that way last month. So they went into the streets, and they decided they didn't want it to be a movement of the right-wing political parties. For example, Le Pen and all of that, the National Front that is represented there, or the left, which is now most organized around a man named Mélenchon, that you should know about if you're not familiar with his name. He is the de facto leader of the left in France now. People didn't want this to be a party action. They wanted this to be a popular uprising. They had to come up with something that wasn't emblematic of a political party. So they hit upon yellow vests. I believe if I understand this correctly, under French law, if you have an automobile, you are required to keep in the trunk of the automobile two things. A little red triangle thing that sort of reflects light, so that if you have a problem on the highway, you set up this little triangle, and oncoming cars, their light shines on the triangle, and they see this triangular red thing, and they slow down, or they help you, hopefully, and so forth. And the other thing is a reflective yellow vest, which you are to put on to protect you, whereas a little triangle protects the car. So everybody the French are crazy about cars, so everybody has a car. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but an awful lot of people have cars, which means everybody, regardless of their politics, has access to a yellow vest. So this became the emblem, the gilet jaune in French, the emblem of this movement. And the initial thing was to go into the streets, particularly near energy depots where gas and oil are stored and distributed, because that was the initial issue, and to block access. Trucks could not get to or out from these depots as a way of protesting, not that they were going to take care of the environment, but that they were making average people pay. And the arguments from the beginning were, we, the middle class of France, has been squeezed and squeezed and squeezed, both before the 2008 crash and since, and our standard of life is under attack, and we won't stand for it anymore. It's been attacked this way, this way, this way, this way, but this tax on fuel is the last straw. It's the straw that breaks the back of the people's tolerance. That was the initial demand. Very quickly, as the popularity of this blew everybody away, the organizers, many of whom have given interviews, had no fantasy notion they would get this kind of response. They were as amazed by that as the early people to set up tents in Zuccotti Park were amazed at what kind of reaction the next 6 weeks after that, as people set up tents in parks in 300 cities across the United States. You had an even greater explosion. At one point, 700 cities across France, cities and towns, were having yellow vest demonstrations. Quickly, the demands escalated. They began with raising the minimum wage significantly. They included not elongating the pension age, making you have to wait longer. That was rescinded. They had tried to do that. That was rescinded. Most recently, about 2 weeks ago, the demand went up to tax corporations and the rich who had been evading a whole host of taxes. In France, like you saw that with Trump, in France, wealthy people, big businesses, at least those that I know, it's like a sport. You get together in a French person's home in the afternoon or in the evening, and the businessmen regale each other with hilariously funny stories of how they get out of taxes. This one has a special account in Geneva. This one has a special account in Basel. This one has a shell company in the Virgin Islands. This one, and they compare notes on how they get out. It's really fun, and I've been involved in this, and I find it terribly funny. But not in this audience, because you understand what the game is. All French people know this. I always think of that song by Leonard Cohen. I don't know if many of you have. Everybody Knows. Remember that? Leonard Cohen's amazing song, because it tells you this story. Everybody knows. In France, everybody knows, but it's something you don't do much about. It's legendary. Everybody does it. Periodically, French people are caught coming back from Geneva with a suitcase full of money. Sarkozy's career ended when he was caught with money from the woman, what's her name, who's the head of the cosmetic company. I forget her name. What? No, I don't think it was Louder. L'Oreal, that's right, L'Oreal. And I forget her name. It's the woman who owns L'Oreal. She had obviously given him buckets full of money, suitcases full of money, and then got caught since didn't take the precautions to avoid it. The interesting thing that I want, massive. This is the entrance of the people into direct political action. They're not waiting for an election. They're not waiting for political parties. They're in the street and they're making the demands. And they got them. The tax on fuel, gone. The changing of the pension, gone. The raising of the minimum wage, accomplished. They got it. They got things that French politicians said couldn't be done in years, and they did it in 3 weeks. Whoa. You know why this is important? That's right, because everybody can do that. This is a lesson. It reminds you. You know, in the Wizard, isn't it in the Wizard? No, Dorothy in the Wizard of Oz. There's a line in there at a certain point where I don't remember who says it to whom, but somebody says to the person that the people had the power. They just didn't know it. They always had the power. They always had it. They just didn't know that they had it. The French are in that moment. They're realizing, my goodness, the last 2 days are like a pinnacle of why this isn't going to go away. 2 days ago, desperate, because Mr. Macron is caught. He is part of the elite, the École Normale, people who become the government in France. He was, by the way, it's a shame to say it, he was a cabinet minister in the socialist government a couple of years ago, before that disappeared, Mr. Hollande's government. Then when he saw that Mr. Hollande's popularity went into the toilet. Why? Because the socialist Hollande had won an overwhelming electoral majority by promising to end austerity in France, to end the squeezing of the mass of people to get out of the crisis. He was going to squeeze the rich. He won the election overwhelmingly because of it. The socialists, for the first time, had the presidency, the Assemblée Nationale, and the Senate. They controlled all three houses. They hadn't had that before. And in a matter of 2-3 years, he went into the toilet. Why? Because he administered the austerity he had promised to get rid of. And the French people turned on him big time. And they would have voted for the conservative leader in the last election, except he got caught. I hope I'm reminding you, if you didn't notice it, was a wonderful French moment. This fellow who was scheduled to win the election, it was the conservative, because usually in France you had the socialists and then the conservatives, like we have Republicans and Democrats, pretty much. But he got caught during the election, the conservative, having created 3 phony jobs, each paying better than 100,000 euros a year. But he was very generous. 1 went to his wife, 1 went to one of his children, and 1 went to the other child. And he got caught. And the French people, a good number of them still voted for him, which is something to think about, but an awful lot didn't. And that made it possible for Mr. Independent Macron, who no one really knew about or heard about or cared about, who had no political party, he was independent, he became the president because of the vote. By the way, only 2 or 3 percentage points ahead in the election of Mr. The left-wing guy, Mélenchon. Just 2 or 3 percentage points in that first election. Very close. Okay, so Mr. Macron, over this weekend, desperate, because he has to placate the rich, because they're the ones who run everything in France. But he has to do something about this mass movement, which has 60, 70+% of the people. How's he going to do this? He has no idea. And since he has the skill of a dead iguana, no disrespect to iguanas, a dead one, right? Can't expect much. He does one stupid thing after another, but over this last weekend, he outdid himself. He invited the French people, it's just that arrogance again, he invited the French people to a débat national, a national debate over the issues raised by the Yellow Vest movement. Okay, that's not smart, because it means that the president is inviting a debate over what this mass protest movement has put on the agenda. He didn't put it on the agenda. The Congress didn't put it on the agenda. No political party. The people put it on the agenda. What a strange idea that the nation is going to debate something that the people put on the agenda directly. But that wasn't the best part. He named a woman to lead the national debate, a minister in his government. And the next morning, which was yesterday morning, the French newspapers reported on her salary while she would be leading the debate. $200,000 a year. She is going to be the government leader of the debate with the mass of the French people who are demanding basic economic benefits that are a small fraction of what their other side of the debate is being paid. It made the Gilets jaunes movement, 20 times stronger. 10 minutes it took, as everybody heard the story. The stupidity of that is so grotesque, so enormous, that you realize it's out of control. They don't know what they're doing. They're lurching around from one thing to another. It's one of those examples in which one of the reasons you're doing well is because your enemies are so dumb, are making so many mistakes. They are helping you because they don't know what to do. They've never faced this situation before. They don't know how to cope. And everything they do makes it worse for them. There already is a powerful Gilets jaunes movement in the Netherlands. It has already spread. There is a fairly strong one in Belgium. There have begun to be scenes in Britain. The Italians are following it with enormous interest, as you can see from the front pages of Italian newspapers. Everybody is wondering, and above all the leaderships, because they all see in Mr. Macron an image of themselves. What would they do if this disease catches here? Everything Macron did to bring it down failed. There were scenes, some of you saw them, because one of the few things that got picked up in the United States was when there was violence, which was particularly in Paris. In certain parts of Paris, the Champs-Élysées and a couple of other areas, there was demonstrators set cars on fire and threw rocks through windows and stuff like that. Tiny fraction of all the movement, the vast majority of demonstrations which took place outside of Paris had no violence whatsoever at any time, not before, not now, but the focus, and that was, that's standard operating procedure for the government, to focus on the violence in the hopes that people who might be sympathetic to the goals will get turned off by the violence and therefore pull away. They thought that was happening between December 20th and the end of the year, but it turns out that that was people turning to the holidays and having their Christmases and their New Year's. Once that's over, they're right back again. So that hope of that's why he called for the national debate, because he has to try to cope. At this point, it's unclear what's going to happen.
He should put on a vest and get in front of it. I mean, that's the obvious thing to do.
Yeah, but that's not who he is. It's not how the French work either. But it might be an idea for him. You might try to call him. I'm sure he's very desperate at this point. To the New York Times, yes, something like that. The right wing in France is trying, all the political parties are trying somehow to navigate a difficult situation. They're not wanted. Stay away. We don't want to be drawn in to your political maneuvering. It's not that they aren't sympathetic. A movement this big is like the French population. It's half to the left, half to the right, roughly speaking. But the parties are trying to be friends, allies, not get on their nerves, not be pushed away. Probably the biggest influence at this point is Mélenchon. It's from the left, not the right. You can see that in the demands, but you can also see it in the identity of the few people that are getting, they're not the leaders because they don't have that, but they are spokespersons, and those tend to be people that are close to Mélenchon. So it's obvious that they have a bit of an edge, but no one knows quite how this is going to play out. But it is an intervention. It's overwhelmingly focused on economics. The critique of economic suffering is number one. It's not that they aren't interested in cultural issues and political, but it's about wages, it's about taxes, it's about pensions, it's about money. It's a little bit like the Occupy Wall Street, which was so remarkable in America because it wasn't about sexism and racism and all the other issues that are important, but it was about the 1% versus the 99%, which puts the economics right up front. That's what they're doing too. And they're not being dissuaded. The government's effort to hit them with the violence didn't work. The government's threats, the government has arrested now 2,000 or 3,000 people. Over this last weekend, the government announced it was mobilizing the military, and when pressed by the newspapers, it was, you ready, you'll love this, to protect the protesters from the violent enemy elements. So, I mean, very clear, trying to split this movement apart. None of this has worked. And my guess is nothing is changing in France, nothing of the sort that would address these issues. The things Macron has done, which are powerful symbols of what they could achieve, are still not anywhere near adequate to change the basic situation. So we have, in effect, a stalemate. A minority government confronted with a mobilized population, which has already won all kinds of things that the doubters had said you could never win. So they are in a very powerful position, unlike anything that one has seen for a long time. That's why it's important for you all, please follow this, pay some attention. Google is a lovely instrument. You can, Google any of these words and take you right to the newspapers. And again, the Le Monde in France, its stuff is published in English. So you don't need to read the French to be able to get at their coverage. Okay, next item.
Isn't it interesting that no politician in the United States of any stature has tried to get out in front of this? Put on a vest, literally.
But my guess is that you will see It'll take a while, it usually does in the United States, but there will be somebody who thinks through that maybe putting on a yellow vest might get a lot of interest among your fellow citizens if you were to wear it.
I've got vests available, by the way.
Okay, we have an offer. See that? How quickly it can go, how quickly it can go. Or maybe we should have in the United States some other color, you know, so let them have the yellow, we would have, I don't know, green, ecological vests or something, or red, even better, that's right.